students! All right, let's get into ancient Egypt. Woohoo! Remember last week we finished up with the concept that while we are progressing through time this semester, we will be also moving backwards and forwards through areas, and we need to rewind time. So we were in ancient Near East in Mesopotamia, and we saw the Sumerians, and then the Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Neo-Babylonians, Persians. Yes, yes, yes. Well, now we're going to rewind time and go to ancient Egypt, and we're going to look at art of the pre-dynastic Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. Technically, we're going to start right here, right before the Old Kingdom. But look at the time frame. We are going way back to 2500 BCE. So pre all of the artwork, or most of the artwork that we saw. The location is, while all of what we learned last week is happening in ancient Mesopotamia, we're going to be looking at this area of the continent of Africa and how it is remarkably different from ancient Mesopotamia. What do I mean by that? Well, while ancient Mesopotamia had constant upheaval, overthrow, there were always enemies who were vying for control in ancient Near East. We see a contrast to that in ancient Egypt. It's not to say that there wasn't any war, but there were more or longer periods of relative peace and prosperity. To mark the time in ancient Egypt, historians use this method. Here we are looking at our time frame. The beginning of civilization happens around 3500 BCE, and historians refer to it as the pre-dynastic. And we see the end of the ancient Egyptian empire around 1700 BCE in the New Kingdom. Now, these are not the time frames that the Egyptians would have used. No, 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 no. This is what scholars have used to look back and organize into pre-dynastic, dynastic meaning families or generations of kings and queens. So we have the pre-dynasty, and then the dynasties, which there are 31 in total, are divided into Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. And the markers between Old and Middle and New are times of unrest or upheaval, the collapsing of power in the kingdom. Now, again, this is not what they would have said. They would not have said, oh, I live in the Old Kingdom. Oh, I'm part of the Middle. Middle of what? No, 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 no. These are terms that historians have used to define or organize this massive amount of time of relative stable peace and prosperity. I've given you a vocab word here because I'll be using it in this class. I'll be using it interchangeably with king. The word is pharaoh. And a pharaoh is another word for king of ancient Egypt, although technically, and if you're, a hardcore Egyptian nerd like me, technically, pharaoh as a term for the king of ancient Egypt doesn't even come about until the New Kingdom. So it's not a term that they would have used to define their kings in the Old Kingdom or Middle Kingdom. It only comes about in the New Kingdom, and I'm a nerd for words. The word pharaoh means like the big house or the palace. So it was a way of referring to the king without using his sacred name. Yes, sacred, because similar to many of the cultures that we saw in ancient Mesopotamia, the Egyptians believed that their leader, the king, is a god here on earth, and that they have been blessed by the gods with this human form of their religious entities. So to call him a pharaoh, to call him the palace or the big house, is a way to not sully his sacred name. I know. Let's get into the geography of ancient Egypt. This is another reason why ancient Egypt has so many periods of relative peace and prosperity. The continent of Africa is, well, technically, we're looking at the area above the Sahara Desert, and we're looking at the area in the corner between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and this small peninsula here between Arabia, or the Arabian Peninsula, and what is now modern day Egypt. The modern day country of Egypt does follow with many of the borders of the modern, or the ancient empire of Egypt. So we see natural borders of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. This Sinai Peninsula between the Arabian Peninsula and the main continent of Africa has difficult borders for defining. It's a fluctuating border of Egypt. They will oftentimes leak into Arabia and up into the Middle East or the Near East. It also is divided on the west and in the south by the arid landscape of the Sahara. So if you think about it, this element, or this area of the African continent, has 4 natural borders that are very difficult to break through. If you want to attack from the north, well, they're going to see you coming because you have to land on their shores. Same with the Red Sea in the east. If you want to surprise attack them, it's not going to happen because you have to land on their shores. The south and the west are protected by extreme desert situations. So yeah, try getting through that desert and see how strong you are before you can come and attack us. The Nile River, which has its origins in the south and dumps into the Mediterranean, is the life force of the ancient Egyptians, and it still is today. In fact, it is so much a life force of the ancient Egyptians that the word for traveling north and south is to travel with or against the river. So if you want to say you're traveling north, then you would be flowing with the river, and if you were traveling south, you would say that you were flowing against the river. Also, the geography of the land refers to it as Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Now, this is where it can get crazy confusing for students because we think of upper as like north. No. Think of this as on a gradient. And as the water from the mountains and the Nile source in Ethiopia travels downstream, it dumps into the marshlands near the Mediterranean. So the mountains are Upper Egypt. The marshlands are Lower Egypt. I know it takes a little adjustment to think of the north as lower and the south as upper. But if you think about it in terms of the plane that the water has to fall down, Upper Egypt is in the south because that's where the mountains are, and Lower Egypt is in the north where the marshlands, and it dumps into the Mediterranean. You got that? So because of this natural barriers in the north, south, east, and west, it is difficult to attack and therefore difficult to conquer, and therefore easier to maintain on this Nile, this river system, a cohesive government, a cohesive culture, a cohesive language, a cohesive religion. You might be thinking, well, the ancient Mediterranean, or the ancient Mesopotamia, it had 2 major rivers. It had the Tigris and Euphrates, and they fought all the time. Okay, this is geography. This is me geeking out here. The land in ancient Mesopotamia has a lot more sediment, and so the river systems of the Tigris and the Euphrates are inconsistent. Meaning, not that the water flow is inconsistent, but the pathways. The Tigris and Euphrates are notorious for changing their route as they move across the land. And so you might have a city against the Euphrates, and you're like, yay, we got this river system. And then a major flood happens, and then it redirects the Euphrates 20 miles away from you. And now your city is in the middle of a desert. Unlike Egypt, the rocks that make up the continental shelf in Egypt are not sedimentary and much more harder and more difficult. And so really the Nile is following a canyon which has a much more predictable pathway. It also floods. The rain in Egypt is extremely minimal. Here, this is a map of modern day Egypt, but this shows you the floodplain of the Nile River. The Nile floods seasonally. It is extremely predictable, not because of the rain in Egypt. No, Egypt gets like less than an inch of rain a year. The seasonal flooding of the Nile comes from in the south, where the rain in Ethiopia will flood and swell the river. It will then rush down to the Mediterranean and it will overflow its borders. Now, oftentimes we think, oh no, flood, that's bad, right? Not in ancient Egypt. They understood the system of water as dumping all of this. The flood system is dumping all of this rich, thick, black, heavy in nutrients silt all across this arid landscape. So the flood is actually fertilizing the land, and they would foster or they would allow or control these floods into these very fertile farmlands, which is also different from ancient Mesopotamia. I'm sorry if this is boring you, but I love this, okay? In ancient Mesopotamia, remember they've developed those irrigation systems to bring water from the Tigris or the Euphrates down into their specific farmlands. The water would be directed out and then it would, do its thing and evaporate. It would leave a very heavy salt content in the soil. An extremely heavy salt content will then make the land inoperable. Not a great place to grow things. So even within their planned irrigation in the ancient Mediterranean or ancient Mesopotamian world, there would be times of famine and failed crops because of the over-salinization, over-salting of those landscapes. That does not happen in Egypt. Why? Because the flood not only dumps the nutrients, but then when it recedes, it pulls out all of the salt. I know, I love geology, so I love this. Okay, so the floods are good in ancient Egypt. And they learned to control the water with canals and irrigation systems, very similar to what we see in ancient Mesopotamia, but without the risk of salinization. I show you this picture of modern day Egypt because it shows you the borders of the floodplain, the Nile River in the middle, and then the floodplain is about 2 or 3 miles on either side. So that is where you would have your crops. And then the cities would be dotted up and down the river. I also like this picture of modern day Egypt because it shows you that even today, there is a very clear line of life and death. Life is close to the river, and death is just a few miles away in that hot, arid, inhospitable landscape. This concept of living so close physically to life and death is a concept that many historians, myself included, credit as part of the reason why in ancient Egyptian art and ancient Egyptian religion and ancient Egyptian culture, we see this heavy emphasis on life and death. This concept of life and death is something they are constantly aware of in their physical environment, and it's going to be reflective in their art. Please, if you want to know more about ancient Egypt, email me. Okay, let's move to our next video, and we're going to look at the first king to establish a united Upper and Lower Egyptian Empire.